I agree with Brother Don about Mark. I wish Brother Don, though, would stop asking me when I'm going to grow up, because I'm stuck at this height, so that's it. No, Mark, we really do appreciate Mark and have enjoyed watching him grow, especially my family. We haven't gotten to see Mark grow from the time he was little, but we've seen him grow tremendously in his faith, and even just the last few years, and I count him as a good friend, and I'm thankful to know him and his family. And it's good to see people that you love leading in the Lord's church, and we have a lot of that here, and so we're blessed tremendously to be able to do that. Being able to make a choice is a powerful blessing that God has given us. There are so many things that we get to choose. We get to choose who we marry in this country, what job we want to have, what home we want to buy, what car we want. We get to make that decision. There are some things, though, we didn't get to choose. I didn't get to choose what family I was born into. I didn't get to choose how many siblings I had. I didn't get to choose how my mother and father behaved. That wasn't up to me. But I get to choose so much in life, and Jesus and the Lord blessed us with the greatest blessing of all outside of the Lord's church in the opportunity that we have to choose. If you were to think about the idea of, in order to get your wife to tell you that she loved you, or your husband, you had to pull a string on the side of them, that wouldn't feel like love, because they'd be programmed to tell you that. And the fact is that we get to lay down in our lives and be with the people that we love and spend time with our families. That's a great blessing that God has given us, to be able to choose who we want to spend our lives with. But there is a choice that is made in Joshua 24:15. And there were a lot of things that go along with this choice. But Joshua stresses that he wants the children of Israel to choose wisely. He doesn't say it that way, but that's essentially what he's saying in Joshua 24:15. And so I got to thinking, how does one choose wisely? Because look, I have chosen things in my life that I thought were going to be the greatest blessing, and they ended up being one of the biggest curses in my life ever. And I think all of us have been in that situation. We thought when we got this item, or we thought when we made that decision, that we were going to be so happy, and then we're not. This happens, of course, a lot in the financial world. If you listen to any financial talk show host, especially the Dave Ramsey shows, people call in all the time. I thought I wanted this. I thought I was going to benefit from it, and now I'm miserable. Well, they made the choice nonetheless. And so how does someone really get to choose wisely? Because we all make mistakes. We've all messed up the biggest decisions that we could make at times. And so one article suggests that what we first need to do is to be calm and analyze potential problems. Be calm. Analyze potential problems. Don't panic, and many poor decisions are made because people panic and don't think properly about consequences of the decision they're going to make. Think long term, essentially. Slow down, take some deep breaths in and out, think about the future of what you're about to do today. Always look ahead. The second thing is consult people. Nothing wrong with a good consultation and asking people, what do you think I should do? Here's my situation. Can you give me some advice? And so we consult people. The final one that I saw was to think of the positives and negatives of each choice. Now, I am this type of person, and my wife will tell you, sometimes it is rather annoying. I'll admit that. I want to know every detail of everything that we are planning, down to the minute almost, of when it's going to happen, what's going to happen. All right, walk me through it. I got to know. And Ryan doesn't really like this, I don't think, either. But that's just who I am. I want to know every detail. And sometimes I'll say to both of them as different situations come up, what if this happens and it's something that's negative? Well, what I'm trying to do there is to factor in that there might be a negative consequence. There might be a negative consequence for what we're about to do. Okay, so let's say we buy this item. What's the negative consequence that's going to come from it? Okay, let's say we do this thing. What might be negative about it? But what are the pros? What are the absolute wonderful blessings that can come from doing this? Do they outweigh the negatives? Are the negatives things that we can just get over and move on? And that's what we're asked to do when we try to make wise decisions. And so Joshua is giving his last address ever to these people. And he gives them an opportunity to make a choice. And I want us to notice in the first place that the choice is personal. It is a personal choice. It is a command that we can choose not to follow. I want to let that sink in for a moment, because you can choose today to not serve the Lord. That can be your choice if you want it to be. That can be your decision. And you can make that choice according to Joshua 24:14. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away, and notice this, the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river in Egypt. Serve the Lord. But it's a choice that we can choose not to do, evidently, because that's exactly what they've done. Put away the gods that you have been serving. You haven't made the decision to continue to follow the Lord. You're committing spiritual idolatry. And really, also spiritual adultery. They are cheating on God. You know how I know this? Because the book of Hosea, chapter 1 and verse 2, tells me that when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, he said to him, "Go and take yourself a wife of harlotry." Imagine that for a minute. Imagine God saying to you, men, I want you to marry a woman that is going to be unfaithful to you. And you're going to know it. Adultery is a horrible, horrible destroyer of God's family. But oftentimes it's a destroyer because it's unaware to the family that someone is cheating in that marriage. And when it is finally revealed, it destroys the family. It can destroy the church. It can destroy the community. A lot of things can come about from adultery being discovered in a marriage. But God tells Hosea, you're going to know. Why would God tell him to do this? To take him a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry. Why? Because the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. I want you to know how I feel. And so you go marry a woman who won't be faithful to you. And then you'll know how I feel. And the verse following that says that's exactly what Hosea did. He went out, obeyed the voice of God, and he married a woman that he knew the moment he married her would not ever be faithful to him. I see, going back then through the Old Testament, a picture of spiritual adultery that the children of Israel have committed. And right here in Joshua 24 and verse 14, you see it again. You put away the gods that you've been serving. Come back to the Lord. Serve the Lord. But I see, secondly, that I can't make this choice for you. Joshua couldn't make the choice for the children. He says in verse 15, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, well, then you choose for yourselves. You make the decision. I've got a good friend that has been here before. You know Tate. I talk about Tate a lot. When we went through the Memphis School of Preaching, we lived diagonally across the hall from one another. And our wives clicked and we clicked, and so we became the bestest of all friends in the world. But there is something that we would both tell you we absolutely, in a loving way, despise about the other family, and that is we cannot decide where to go eat. Okay? We will get in the car and we will say, where do we want to go? I don't know. You tell me. Well, what about this place? No, let's get something good. Let's go eat something that's good. Okay, what about this place? No, I don't want to eat there. And finally, I'm telling you, this happens every time. Finally, we decide, we say, okay, well, let's go get Mexican food. Perfect. About halfway there, Tate will call an audible and say, where are we going to eat? Well, I thought we'd said Mexican food, but I guess we're changing that. And so all the time when we talk about seeing each other, that's one of the main things we talk about is, should we start planning dinners now so that we can figure out where we're going to eat when you guys get here in 3 months? Because we know it's going to take up a majority of our time. We might as well get out in front of it. Well, what Joshua is saying is make a decision. And sometimes that's exactly what we have to do. And when we make decisions, if we can actually decide what we're going to do spiritually speaking, at least we know. And Joshua is saying, if you don't want to serve God, at least make a decision. What I see then, after reading this, that I'd never noticed before, was how much Israel wanted to have God, but just in the second place. They wanted God to still be around, but they wanted to serve these idol gods more than Him, and Him be okay with that. Now, in sports, you call that number 2 on the depth chart. What that means is he's not the starter, but if something ever happens to the starter, guess who's going to play? And that's exactly how Israel treated God. God, when we need you, when these other gods aren't working out for us, when we're sick of being oppressed, then we'll turn to you and say, save us, help us. But until then, you stay in your place. And Joshua is evidently begging and beseeching these people, make a choice. Pick who you're going to serve. Is it going to be God, or is it going to be the gods of your fathers? He says in verse 15, you got to serve either the gods your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, you know it, we will serve the Lord. We've made our choice. And you know what's interesting is when you read that a second time through, Joshua has made the choice for his family. Husbands, fathers, you have an obligation. I have an obligation to choose to serve God over anybody else, and to choose to say to our children, to our wives, to our family, we know where we're going to be, and that's serving the Lord. And not to worry about what other people are doing, but to worry about our own families. And Joshua says, you do what you want to do. I can't do it for you, but I can tell you this much. My house, we're going to serve God. We're going to serve the Lord. And if Joshua had the ability to make this decision for them, guess what? He would have. And they never would have been in spiritual idolatry. They never would have been in spiritual adultery. If Joshua could have snapped his fingers and said, I want the children of Israel to be faithful to God, don't you think he would have? I know Paul would have in the New Testament. If he could have snapped his fingers and all of the Jewish nation be members of the New Testament church. We've been studying the book of Romans this year, and you've seen that discussed by Paul. I want my brethren to be saved. And so it's not that Joshua says, I can't do it because I don't want to. Joshua says, I'm not able to. It's physically and spiritually impossible for me to choose for you. You have to pick. You've got to pick. I'm then told that wise counsel is often given, but not followed. How do I know this? This is the end of the book of Joshua. I'm told in the book of Judges, chapter 2 and verse 16, that after the children had chosen to abandon God and His covenant and His law, the Lord would raise up judges to deliver them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Why were they being plundered? Because they'd chosen to neglect God. They had abandoned God, and so God says, I'm going to raise up judges. And then it says in verse 17, they wouldn't listen to the judges. I don't know a whole lot, I promise you. But I know if God raises up someone, and they're doing things the way the Lord wants them to do, that's a pretty wise individual. And yet the children of Israel wouldn't listen to the judges and continued to play the harlot with other gods, bowing down to them, turning quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. They didn't do it. And yet you see the picture of these judges essentially saying to them, serve the Lord, but they wouldn't. It goes on in verse 18 to say, and when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. It came to pass, when the judge was dead, what did they do? They went right back to what they had been before. I was privileged this past week to record some podcasts while I was at Foundations, and we did one on addiction. My sister, who is still doing her best to continue to be away from alcohol and drugs, was on the program discussing the addicted side of things. And we had Scott Kane, who's a minister in New Orleans, talk about the biblical side of this. Something he said about Hosea's wife, I'm starting to think and realize is true about Israel too. Scott made the point that Hosea's wife must have been addicted to sexuality because of the way she lived her life. You know what I'm starting to realize? The children of Israel were addicted to idolatry. And they just couldn't quit. Because they didn't want to. And the only time they would quit, is when they hit a low that was so bad, they would go into spiritual rehab, they would go back and God would bless them, God would take care of the judge. And the moment the judge died, their accountability partner, they'd say, this is too much, and they'd go right back to what they've always done. If that's not an addict, I don't know what is. When you study addiction, that's exactly what you see. People who will go into something, they'll be so addicted by something, and then they'll finally hit what we call rock bottom. They'll say, I'm done, I'm fed up with it. My sister would tell you she was fed up with it 3 or 4 times before she finally had it stick. I look at the children of Israel now and see, especially in the book of Judges, addiction to idolatry. That's what I see. And God would raise these judges. When the judges died, they'd revert back, and then they'd behave even more corruptly than their fathers. And then in verse 20, it says, the anger of the Lord is kindled against Israel. And he says the following, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. God is essentially saying, I'm done. I'm fed up. And I'm going to wipe my hands and say, it's up to you now. I'm sick of helping you. So I won't anymore. You have to make the decision to serve me. And there have been so many depictions of addiction where a family will say that to their loved one, we're not going to help anymore. Because we're sick of helping and you going right back to what you were. Can you blame God for saying that to Israel? I can't. I also find that the wise counsel that's given by Joshua trickles all the way into Nehemiah not being heeded, because in Nehemiah, you might remember when we studied that book last year, that Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 17 says, the whole assembly returned to keep the feast of the booths as they had found written in the law that they hadn't kept since the days of who? Joshua. When Joshua died, it evidently seemed that the spirituality of the Israelite nation died with him. And they stopped keeping commands that God had commanded them to keep. And it went for generations. I don't know if there was anyone, I doubt there was. In fact, I'm almost positive there wasn't anybody in Nehemiah that could have said, I have a relative that lived in the time that we did this. There were people present that day that had never witnessed the Feast of the Booths being done, more than likely. And they didn't use the excuse, we've never done it this way. They said, we need to get back to doing it the way we did when Joshua led us. Because that's what was pleasing to God. And so for generations, the Israelite nation didn't keep part of God's commandments. Wise counsel is often given and not heeded. How many generations did it take? Judges 2:10 tells me, as soon as Joshua and the elders of that nation died, there arose a generation who knew not the Lord. One. It just took one. One nation not following God, one generation not following God, trickled all the way down to nearly the end of the Old Testament. See how important it is for us to follow the wise counsel of godly leaders and to make the decision, as Isaiah said, here am I, send me. I'm going to serve when no one else will. I'm going to do it. But then I'm told that this choice is a priority. In the first place, the choice cannot be put off. He says in the same part of Joshua 24:15, you choose for yourselves when? Today. You pick, and you pick right now. I'm sick and tired of you going back and forth. Remember, Elijah would say in 1 Kings 18, how long are you going to argue between two opinions? Let's determine who God really is then. I'm sick of the fighting. Let's just settle it. And Joshua is evidently saying the same thing. I'm sick of the wishy-washiness. Just settle it. Make a decision and stick to it. If you want to serve the idol gods, then go serve the idol gods. But if you want to serve the Lord, do it today. Make the decision today to change and to go to be what God wants you to be. I can't make you. I can't force you. But if you want to please God, that's what you've got to do. You can't put it off. Secondly, I'm told that our options seem endless. Joshua listed other options that they had other than God. And the options seemed endless because he mentions a plurality of gods. A plurality of gods of their fathers on the other side of the river, and a plurality of gods of the Amorites. So the options seem endless. Man, we can serve whoever we want to serve. But then I'm told that the options are limited. Throughout Scripture, I am told that doing a little bit of both, as the Israelite nation was known for doing, never worked out for them. And when Israel served God, they were the most dominating world power that ever lived and ever existed. And had they served God their entirety, they would have continued to be a world power much longer than they were. Oh yes, I would tell you they rivaled Rome and Alexander the Great. And had they fought those nations and their armies, they wouldn't have stood a chance if God was on the side of the Israelite nation. They wouldn't have been carried away by Babylon into captivity. Babylon wouldn't have stood a chance. But I'm told in Scripture that when one man took some things that he wasn't supposed to take, the entire army of Israel failed. Because God says, I'm no longer with you. I started to wonder, and I don't know that this is true or not, but it makes me wonder if really Israel were fighters. Or if God was just so powerful that he could make them fighters. Because when they didn't have God, they never stood a chance. When they didn't do things the way God told them to do with Moses as keeping his arms up, when his arm began to sink, what happened to the army? They began to lose. God is so powerful that he took a nation that it seems might not have even been good at fighting and made them a world power. One that nobody could touch if they serve the Lord. The options are limited if we want to be truly what God says we can be. And when I study the Old Testament Israelites and I look at them, I see people that couldn't decide what they wanted to do. And so they said, you know what? We'll do a little bit of both. How'd that work out? It didn't. What about the application of this text? We've made a choice, even if we don't realize it. You know, Israel had a bad memory. Not just in the New Testament where they would make the baffling statement, we've never been in bondage to anybody, which is absolutely laughable. Because if you look through and read the Old Testament, you find they were in bondage often. They were in bondage to the Egyptians. They were in bondage during the time of Judges. They were in bondage to the Babylonians, to the Medo-Persian. You could keep listing things and all these different people and all these different things that had taken Israel into bondage. And Israel makes the statement, we've never been in bondage to anybody. They made this statement even now. In Joshua 24 and verse 16 and 8 through 18, the people answered, right after Joshua makes this declaration that my house is going to serve the Lord, you make a decision who you're going to serve. The people answer and say, well, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. Joshua, what are you talking about? We are serving the Lord. We're doing what you want us to do. Yet when I go back and I read verse 15, it says, choose this day whom you serve. And verse 14 says, put away the idol gods that you've been serving. I then know they're not doing what they're professing to do and proclaiming that they're doing. Joshua is then listening to these people saying, the Lord our God is the one. He brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt, the house of, notice what they say here, bondage. They brought us up from the house of bondage, who did these great signs in our sight, preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. It was the Lord who drove out from before us all the people, including the Amorites, who dwelt in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. But Joshua knew the truth, and he tells them in verse 19, you cannot serve the Lord. Wait a minute. Joshua, why are you saying that? I'll tell you why. For God, He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, He'll turn and do you harm and consume you after He has done you good. You want to serve God? You better quit this mess of fooling around with idol gods. You better quit it. You better get it out of your life and out of your system and out of your families, because God will turn around one day and will consume you. The same God that you just mentioned and all those wonderful blessings for you is going to be the source of your hurt, because He's going to be the one bringing people to take you. Now, when I say He's the source of your hurt, understand the reason He will be the source of their hurt is because they themselves abandoned and left Him. And so God, like He would say in the book of Amos, you didn't come to me, you leave me no choice. I'm going to bring you into a nation's hands, and you will be taken into captivity. It was the Lord who sent Babylon. But in a roundabout way, if you really want to get technical, Israel brought Babylon upon themselves, right? You can't serve the Lord. He's a holy God. You need to obey God. Second thing that I find is when we make a contract, we should honor it. You know, I never noticed this before when I read this chapter. And a lot of times when we read Joshua 24, the only verse we really think about is verse 15. Much like if I were to say John 3, your brain immediately goes to 16. So it's just how our brains work. We have a verse of the Bible that's made so popular in our nation and in our culture, and it's hard to think about everything else that's written and said. But there's a contract made here in the end of this chapter. Joshua, in verse 25, or verse 11, 21 I should say, the people are saying again to Joshua, no, we're going to serve the Lord. And Joshua says, well, you're witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord for yourselves to serve Him. And they said, yes, we are witnesses. We agree. Now, therefore, he said, put away the foreign gods which are among you and incline your heart to the Lord and to the God of Israel. And they said, the Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey. Here's a verbal contract that they're making. Verbally. We are going to do this. Joshua, we pledge. We solemnly pledge we'll serve God. But then he practically makes it even harder. I know from my own experience, if you ask me to do something, there's a 50-50 chance I will forget it. And you're thinking, well, it's the same for me too. When my wife tells me things we need at the store, I always tell her this, text it to me. Because if you just tell me, I will forget. Text it to me. Why do I say that? So that when I walk into the store, I can say, okay, eggs, milk, and I can go down the list and grab the items that we need, and I won't forget anything. There have been moments in my forgetfulness where maybe she called me while I was in the store and said, hey, can you get this? And then maybe I bumped into Donna, or I bumped into Wendy, or I bumped into somebody. I got to talking, and guess what I did? Forgot to get the item. So I get home, and I think I've done a great thing, and Megan goes, where's this? I forgot. Joshua understands the people have a tendency to forget what they verbally say they're going to do. So what does Joshua do in verse 25? He made a covenant with the people that day and made them a statue. And I never thought about this until I studied this. But what had Israel been so prone to revering and respecting but statues? Idol gods. The book of Isaiah teaches us that idol gods are nothing. They see nothing, they do nothing, they speak nothing. They are dumb. But Joshua makes this statue, and he says in this next verse, he wrote these words in the book of the law of God. He took a large stone, he set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord, and he said to all the people, this stone, this statue, this stone that I'm putting before you, what is it? It is going to be our witness. It's a witness, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which He spoke to us. It shall therefore be a witness to you, lest you deny your God. You want to serve God? Every time you look at that, you remember the covenant that we've just made together. It's a sign. And you're really good at looking at things like this and revering and respecting them. So let's apply that to the Lord. When you look at this, I want you to remember the covenant you've made today, that you will serve God and that God will be your only God. then I'm told that they didn't honor the contract. Judges 2, 8 through 10 tells me that when Joshua and the elders died, there arose a nation who knew not the Lord. I wonder where that stone was. I wonder if people would look at it and if they'd get this little thing in their mind that said, I know I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. You ever buy a book intending to have a more healthy diet, and then you forget to open it, and so you go back to eating the way that you're supposed to be eating, and then you happen to come across that book and you realize, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And you don't like looking at that book. Not just because it's trying to keep you from eating all the tasty food that you love, but because you know you haven't been doing what that book was trying to do and teach to help you. So I wonder if from time to time they saw that stone and people would think for a moment, I remember what that is. But then we see in Nehemiah, the people had forgotten to do what Joshua had often told them as a leader they needed to do for generations. Multiple families, multiple people. What does it mean to breach a contract? Well, I was curious, and so I asked Google, if I breach a contract, what am I looking at essentially? What would be coming my way? Well, you would go before a judge in most cases, and the judge would have to determine a couple of things. For instance, the breach of contract is a failure without legal excuse to perform any promise that forms all or part of the contract. So if I tell the people that own my house, that have given me a loan, that I will pay this monthly payment, and then I stop paying it, guess what? I'm in breach of contract, and the following would be presented before a judge. Did a contract exist? Okay, let's ask the questions. If so, what did it require of the people or the party? Was the contract modified at any point? Did any change get made that might prevent this person from being punished? Did the claimed breach of contract actually occur? And what damages were caused by the breach? Now look at Israel. They had definitely broken their contract with God. A law existed. Deuteronomy 6 tells me that that law was expected to be passed down from family to family at every part of every day. The law existed. The law had not been modified at any point in their time of following this law. God had never said, by the way, what I said in Exodus 20, where I didn't want any other gods before me, I'm changing my mind on that. So no modification was ever made. And the law required them to do certain things, to serve the Lord, to not have other gods before him, to not commit murder, to not covet, to not do all of the things the law commanded. They knew what the law had said. The breach occurred, and I could have picked a verse in the Bible, but I just put in parentheses in my notes here, practically the entire Old Testament. That breach occurred. Because practically every book of the Old Testament discusses a breach or breaches that are about to occur with the children of God, the Israelites. And then finally, what was the damage? Earlier we talked about Judges 2, 16 through 22. I want you to now go to Judges 2:23. Judges 2:23, after God has said, I'm done, I'm fed up, I'm not helping you anymore, 23 of Judges 2 says, therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. Because the Israelites had left God, God left them. That's what happens when we breach the contract. Breach of a spiritual contract means God will no longer have any part with you or any part with me. Until I do what the contract that I agreed to do states I must do. If I want to be pleasing to God, I know how to do that. The Bible teaches me how to do it. And the greatest blessing that we've ever been given is the ability to choose. I know the Lord's church is great, but if we were born and we were automatically made to be a part of the Lord's church, would that really be such a blessing instead of being able to choose whether we're going to serve the Lord or whether we'll serve Satan? I get the opportunity in my life to say, wow, how I'll live? how my family will live. And Lord willing, by the way that my wife and I lead our home, one day, if our son is married with children, he too will choose how to lead their family in the way of the Lord. My son wasn't born programmed to become a Christian someday. He'll make that choice if he chooses to become one. I wasn't born programmed to become a Christian. I'm not a robot. You're not a robot. We've been given the right and the opportunity to choose. But sometimes our choices hurt God. I know it had to hurt in Genesis 3 when God knew what Adam and Eve had done. I know it had to hurt based on what I read in the Old Testament, how the Israelite nation treated God. But I'm told in the New Testament even that I cannot continue to try to please God and this world. In Matthew 6:24, the Bible tells me, no man can serve two masters. He's either going to love one and hate the other, or he'll serve one and not be loyal to the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, I know mammon there is really discussing money, but the principle applies in any case. No man can serve two masters. I can't serve God and the devil at the same time. It's not possible. Because the way that I live, I'll likely, according to this text, slowly or quickly become biased to one of them. And I'll be loyal to one and despise the other. I'll hate one and love the other. Galatians 1:9, Paul would write, do I now persuade men or God? If I seek to please men, I should not be the bondservant of Christ. And if I were here to be a servant of men, I wouldn't be a bondservant of Christ. What are you saying there, Paul? If I want to please men, I'd be the bondservant of man. But I'm here to please Jesus. And Paul's attitude was, if you don't like me, that's okay. But I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm also told that our lives have meaning when we serve God. In Philippians 1:21 through 23, Paul writes, for to me, if I live, it's Christ. To me, to live is Christ, and to die is what? It's gain. Why is it gain? Well, if I live on the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between two. What do you mean, Paul? You mean you want to die? Yes. Paul, are you suicidal? No. I would rather die, though, to go be with the Lord, which is far better. I am more than happy if my time on earth comes to a close, is what Paul is saying, because it means I get to go be with God. Nevertheless, it's needful, he says in the next verse, for me to be with you. But when I please God, death doesn't have any dominion over me. No problems will occur in my life to the point where I will sit there and say, I've made a bad choice. I'm not saying you have a perfect life. I'm saying that when I serve God, things are easier. You know what I noticed in my own life, my own example? There are certain things in my life that I didn't have a good handle on. All of a sudden, I sit down and I look with my wife and I say, I'm going to do better in this area, or we should do better in this area. And so we start working and we start doing better. And do you know what's amazing? The stress starts to go away. Whether it's financially, whether it's spiritually, when I resolve to be better with my finances, when I resolve to be better with my Lord, my stress, my problems slowly go away. We talk all the time about having an emergency fund in this world. You got to have an emergency fund. You got to have an emergency fund. What about a spiritual fund? To where when temptation comes, we don't stress about it. We just dip into the fund and we come out of that temptation stronger. Who do we choose? Who are we going to choose? Everybody in this room has made a choice today. I don't know what it is for you. I'd like to believe that all of us have resolved in our lives to serve the Lord, but I know it's possible, because if the Israelite nation, God's chosen people, could do it, so can we. To at one time serve God, but to slowly but surely allow a generation to be risen up that doesn't know Him. So what are we going to do with our lives? How are we going to live? How are we going to serve? Who do we choose? If you haven't chosen God, this is the day to do it. Right now, as together we stand and sing.